Today we are going to start Masechet Chullin. We're going to be learning Chullin Daf Bet. We have a unique sponsorship for the Masechet. Masechet Chullin is sponsored by Judy Felber in honor of the Hadron community. During my first cycle of Daf Yomi, just as we began Masechet Chullin, my son was injured while serving in the IDF. Throughout those 2.5 months of difficulty and uncertainty, my fellow learners never left my side. With profound gratitude to the community that held me, encouraged me, and ensured I could keep up with the Daf during those trying times. Thank you for your strength and steady presence. Judy, we will always be with you. Okay, so Masechet Chullin. First, let's talk about the name Chullin. Chullin is the opposite of kodesh, sanctity. We spent a long time, many months, learning about zvachim and menachot. Okay, zvachim and menachot are all about sanctified items. This is clearly the contrast, Chullin. In fact, it used to be called shchitat kodshim and shchitat Chullin. Okay, Masechet Zvachim is called Shchitat Chullin, the slaughtering of, Shchitat Kodshim, the slaughtering of sanctified items. And our Masechet was called Shchitat Chullin, the slaughtering of non-sanctified items. And that's what we're going to see. The whole beginning of the Masechet is all about slaughtering of regular items, not regular meat. Okay, and that's the first part to understand. Our Masechet starts really all about slaughtering, goes from there to treifas, animals that are not kosher. Okay, that are not kosher because they're sick. What constitutes sick? The animal is not. We're not talking about non-kosher animals. We're talking about animals that were actually couldn't really be slaughtered because they were sick at the time. Okay, we'll talk about what kind of sickness. From there, we get into some unique laws that have to do with animals and slaughtering of animals, like a ben pekua, which we'll see what that is, and otov et beno. You can't slaughter the animal and its offspring on the same day. The kisoy adam, when you slaughter, you have to cover the blood. And then we get to gida and ashed, the sciatic nerve, which you're not allowed to eat. Basar b'chalav, we're going to get into milk and meat. It's going to be the more interesting chapter about all different kinds of combinations, like all laws of bitul b'shishim, all that we've touched in other sugyot, but less so in basar b'chalav area. From there, we're going to get to end off with matnot kuna, a bunch of things that the kohanim get not from sacrificial items, but from non-sacrificial items, and end with shiluach ken, sending out the mother bird. Okay, so that's the topics of our Masechet. Excellent introduction by Dr. Iyar Lipson. Worth listening to always. Her introductions are excellent. Give you a framework for the Masechet. Just one more word of intro about shchita, slaughtering of animals. So slaughtering animals is a mitzvah. The Rambam actually counts it as one of the 613 mitzvot. And he says it comes from the Pasuk, Dvarim, and not just the Rambam says this, but Dvarim Yubet, chapter 12, verse 21. It says when you get far away from the temple, and you can't go to the temple all the time to sacrifice your meat, V'zavachta v'achalta. So you will slaughter, zavachta means to slaughter, and you will, and then you can eat, okay, from your animals. So it needs slaughtering, and it says there, kasher tziviticha, like I commanded you. Now, it never says in the Torah how exactly you're supposed to do the slaughtering. That's going to be the topic covered in the beginning of our Masechet. How is the slaughter done? It seems to be something passed down by tradition, especially the Torah even references, like I commanded you, even though it doesn't say specifics of how to do it. That's what we're going to talk about. We didn't actually touch on that in Masechet Zvachim. Right, it wasn't. We talked about shchita a lot, but we never really talked about what exactly shchita is and how you do it, and when it's disqualified, which we're going to already touch on today. Some of the disqualifications. With that, I'll mention that we have Mishnayot bookmarks. Okay, you can find them actually on every single page on our website of Chullin. You can find the bookmark, a link to it by PDF. But you can also order it. Okay, if you didn't order them, if you already ordered the ones for Kodshim and you have for Zvachim and Menachah, you'll also have for Chullin. But if you didn't order for some reason, you can email us at info@hadron.org.il and we'll send them to you. But you can also get the PDF online. Okay, I think that's enough intro. Let's get started with our Masechet. The other thing is that if you're new, so I'll just mention that I often have study guides on the dapim, which help kind of organize the page for you. They're in Hebrew, but they are organized in such a way that even if your Hebrew's not great, you can help see the organization of it. If your Hebrew's good, then it's even better. So you can follow along. There's a study guide for today. And I play around with fonts and colors, like the purple font is psukim from the Torah, and the red is Tanaitic materials, and that helps you kind of see what is written by the Gemara and what are quotes from other sources. And that's always important because the kind of where things come from is when you're learning Gemara, to be able to separate the Tanaitic sources, the ones that come from the time of the Mishnah, from the Amoraic sources, which are the Gemara rabbis talking, is very important. Today we're even going to talk about the fact that in the beginning of Masechtot often, and other in all sorts of sections this happens, but this is a very typical classic beginning of a Masechet, which seems more like a Sephoraitic, or Stama'i, which is a later time period. In the time of the Gemara time period ended around the year 500, and then people wrote notes on the side of the Gemara after that, and often they got incorporated into the printed text. So it's a bit of a different style. It's a lot about linguistics, and today we're going to deal a lot with the wording of the Mishnah and why they use certain wording, and also very common in the beginning of Masechtot, which we've seen many, many times, is it's going to quote all sorts of other Mishnayot from around Shas to try to prove a point here or there about the language used in our Mishnah, comparing it to the language used in other Mishnayot. It's going to be a lot of language issues today. So we're going to start with our Mishnah. Hakol shochatin. Everyone can do shchita. V'shchita tang shera. Okay, today we're going to read a Mishnah and we're going to see that there's a lot of problems and there's a lot of things that are unclear. So everyone can do shchita, which sounds like women, for example. Okay, although we're going to see that Tosfot quotes an opinion that women can't do shchita. It seems like women, we're going to talk about people maybe who are impure. Often it could be Eved Kanani, like a Canaanite slave who's a pseudo-Jew. They kind of are semi-converted. Okay, so Hakol sounds like everyone can do shchita. And then it says, Ushchita tang shera, and their shchita is valid. Okay, now if everyone can do it, then obviously their shchita is valid. And this language really makes no sense, seems to be saying the same thing twice. So, and often when we say Hakol shochatin, everyone can do it. It sounds like ideally. In an ideal, we call it lechatchila. And shchita tang shera is usually a language used saying, well, if they did it, it's valid, but not that we recommend doing it. That we call b'diavad. Post facto, we'll say it's okay. Well, it doesn't make sense to say, well, everyone can do it lechatchila in an ideal sense, and then say, well, but if they did, it's actually post facto, it'll be valid. Those two statements contradict each other, so we're going to try to be figuring that out in our Gemara. Okay, then, so let's stop for a minute on the word hakol and let's talk about the women issue. So Tosfot quotes here, Katuv b'Ilchot Eretz Yisrael, the first Tosfot on the page. Dinashim lo yishchatu, women shouldn't slaughter, mipnei sheda'atan kalot. Now we're going to start raising the issue here. Da'atan kalot is something that many of us are familiar with. It means they're lightheaded. It means they're not, right now, often we use that in the context of the sugyot that talk about the opinions that say women shouldn't learn Torah because they're lightheaded, they won't properly understand it. Or maybe treat it with frivolity. Okay, there's all different interpretations. What's the context in shchita? What does it have to do with anything? Well, in shchita, we're going to see that one of the disqualifications is if you stop in between. So there's two simanim, you have to cut the trachea and the esophagus. And if you stop in between a certain amount of time, it's disqualified. Now, so why would women stop in between if they're lightheaded or da'atan kalot, however exactly we translate that? So they say, well, women might faint. They're faint-hearted. They might get squeamish. Okay, women are often squeamish. That's the concern, that they might faint. If they faint, well, then there'll be shehiyah, which we're going to call that waiting period, which will disqualify the shechita. So better they not do it. Okay, and that might be another reason also why we're going to see the cheresh, shoteh, and katan don't do it. Okay, so Tosfot quotes this in Chot Eretz Yisrael. In Eretz Yisrael, they had this book that said that women don't do it. Tosfot says, Einire, can't possibly be, because you might remember that in Zvachim we already learned that women can do shechita. If women can do shechita in the temple, where you might have thought, like, Kohanim and, in general, so we allow non-Kohanim, but women can't be Kohanim. So, and yet they can do shechita there, then of course they can do shechita on Chullin. It would make absolutely no sense. And he basically rejects completely what they say in the Chot Eretz Yisrael. If you go ahead and you look at how the poskim paskin, so the Rambam paskins that women can do shechita, and the Shulchan Aruch paskins that women can do shechita. But the Rama with the Ashkenazi note says, but the minhag is that women don't. Okay, and he basically says, like, based on the common custom, women don't do shechita. Okay, but there's no real prohibition about it. It seems very clear that women can do shechita without a problem. Okay, so again, we don't really understand the interplay between the first phrase and the second phrase. They seem to contradict each other. We'll get back to that. Then it says, chutz mi cheresh, shoteh, v'katan. Okay, cheresh, shoteh, v'katan is the classic three that go together. Cheresh is deaf, mute, someone who can't speak and can't hear. And a shoteh is someone who does not have sound mind. And a katan and a minor, These are usually people that are considered, they don't have dat, they don't have knowledge, understanding, and they're not really obligated in mitzvot, and they don't, right? So they don't do shchita. And it says here exactly what we're worried about. Shema yakalkelu et shchitatam, which actually is interesting, because normally you'd say, well, they're not chayv in mitzvot, so they can't do this. Here it seems like that's not the issue. Okay, I forgot to mention, by the way, shchita is a little different than an average mitzvah. It's not like there's a mitzvah to slaughter. There's a mitzvah that if you want to eat meat, then you have to slaughter it. Then the mitzvah kicks into play. It's what we call a matir. It's a permitter mitzvah. So it sounds like maybe even the cheresh shoteh theoretically could, but what's the concern? The concern is they might mess up the shchita, either for one of two reasons. Either because they don't know hilchot shchita, and in fact the poskim, when they talk to the Shulchan Aruch about everyone can slaughter, they do mention that it should be a mumche. It should be someone who knows what they're doing. Okay, like I don't think I would want to get up and do shchita tomorrow. I don't really know what I'm doing. But maybe by the time we finish this masechet, we'll say, oh, we know what we're doing. But I still don't think so. You would have to practice. And, by the way, they talk about this later, about practicing. And the other concern is maybe they would faint also. Maybe they'll be squeamish. Okay, another concern. Now, all of these people, now this is a little bit strange, we're going to have to figure out who are all these people who slaughtered and others see them. The shchita is kshera, the shchita is good, meaning if somebody's watching and they see it was done well, then it's fine. Now, presumably it would sound like they're talking about the cheresh, shoteh, and katan. The problem is, and we're going to see this in the Gemara later, that they say the language doesn't make sense, because if you said, other than a cheresh, shoteh, katan, and then it continues to say, but if they did, it should have said, ve'im shachatu, not v'kulan, and all of them shachatu. If you say it's talking about the women and everyone else who's in that hakol shachatim, well, you already said lechatchila they could do it. You don't need anyone to be watching them. So what exactly is that referring to? We're also going to have a question. So I've left you with reading this Mishnah and commenting how, even though the words seem kind of simple, it's actually a very confusing Mishnah. So now we're going to start with our question. So the Gemara starts off and says, hakol shachatim lechatchila u'shchitatang kshera diavad, and basically raises the problem with those first few words. I'm already going to share the study guide right now, and we can follow along in the study guide. So it says that everyone slaughters. Okay, 1 second. Okay. So a kol shochatim, okay, everyone can slaughter. And then it says, right, that sounds like it's lechatchila. Ideally, u'shchitatang kshera sounds like diavad, so it seems to contradict. So now we have to figure out how this works. So before we even get into the answer, we're going to have a back and forth between Rav Acha and Rav Ashi, trying to figure out, is this a valid question or not? Rav Acha doesn't think it's even a valid question. And they're each going to bring sources to prove their point. Rav Acha is going to say this is not a valid question, because who's to say that hakol shochatin is lechatchila? Okay, that's why I wrote here, hakol is not lechatchila. Okay? Further down, we're going to see, after Rav Acha tries to prove, and Rav Ashi counters it, and then Rav Acha has another proof, and from there it really does sound like hakol is not lechatchila. Then we're going to have the counter of Rav Ashi, where Rav Ashi is going to prove what he means. Hakol is lechatchila. Okay, and then we're going to be left with, well, sometimes it is and sometimes it's not, and then we're going to have to, explain why Rav Ashi really thought that this was a good question. Okay, so that's what we're going to do right now. Amar le Rav Acha berei Rav Ashi. Hakol lechatchila. What? Every time it says hakol, it's lechatchila. Ela me'ata. From there, look at this Mishnah. It's the first Mishnah in Tmura. It says hakol mimirin echad hanashim ve'echad hanashim. Okay, everyone can do Tmura. Now, what is Tmura? Let's talk about Tmura. Tmura in the pasuk it says it here anyway, I'll read it. Lo yachlifenu v'lo yamiro totov b'ra'u rabitov. There's a prohibition in the Torah that if I designate an animal for sacrifice, and then I decide, you know what, I want a different one, a better one, or a worse one, it doesn't really matter, I'm not allowed to do it. Lo yachlifenu v'lo yamiro to. I can't replace it. However, if I do, it's effective, meaning my original one is still sanctified, and the new one is also sanctified. That's what it means. Hakol mimiri means even the second one is sanctified. Now, when it says hakol mimiri, meaning if a man did it, echad hanashim ve'echad hanashim, whether a man did this tmura or a woman did the tmura, it's going to be effective. Now, hachinami de lechatchila. Now, you can't say it, but you're going to say that's lechatchila. Ideally, everyone. Now, if you say it's lechatchila, what does it mean? Hakol mimirim echad hanashim ve'echad hanashim. Men and women, all of them should do Tmura. That's what lechatchila means, ideally. Of course, you can't say they can ideally do Tmura. Haktiv lo yachlifenu v'lo yamiro toto b'ra'u rabitov. It says in the pasuk, you absolutely can't do this. So you can't possibly say the hakol is lechatchila. And that's Rav Acha's first proof. To which Rav Ashi responded and says, what are you talking about? That's not your question. That's a unique exception to the rule, because hatam kidikatani tama, there it says the reason why it's not going to work there. Okay? So he says, hatam, it says exactly why hakol mimirim, why it is effective. Lo shahadam rashai lahamir. Now it tells you, not that you can do this lechatchila, okay? You can't do this. Ela she'im hemir, but if you did it anyway, mumal, it's effective. But you're going to get 40 lashes for it. Meaning, the Mishnah specifically tells you, don't think hakol here means you can ideally do this. Of course you can't. It's forbidden. Okay? So that's not a good example, because the Mishnah there reacts and says this isn't lechatchila. Why would they do that if not because it is lechatchila normally? Okay. Second attempt of Rav Acha to prove that hakol is actually is not lechatchila. Hakol ma'arichim v'nerachim nodrim v'nidarim. Okay, now we move to the Mishnah in the beginning of Erchin. Okay, it's interesting that we're comparing the first Mishnayot in Tmura, right? The first Mishnah in Chullin to the first Mishnah in Tmura and the first Mishnah in Erchin. Now, Erchin is a Masechet all about, I can dedicate the value of a person to the temple, and someone can dedicate my value. And if they do Erchin, and they say the erech of someone, the value of someone is on me, then they have to give the value based on Torah. The Torah gives a certain amount for a woman, for a man. We're going to get into all that when we get to Erchin, depending on your age. You can also do Nodrim and Nidarim. Okay, so let's just explain for a minute. Okay, there's another way to do it. You could say the value of a person is upon me. Meaning, I'm going to say, I'm taking not the erech, that's the erech, the value, but I can say demei ploni. Okay? It's the same idea. It's giving the value of a person. But if I use erech, it's the value, set value in the Torah. It doesn't matter what time we're living in and what the value of a person is in the shuk. Rather than the value of a person in the marketplace, it means if they were going to be sold as a slave. If I say demei, which is the value and money of this person, and use it, it's just a different word than erech, then I have to pay what the value is in the marketplace at that given time. So when it says hakol ma'arichin, that means everyone can say the words, I'm giving the value of this person on to the temple, and ne'erachin, and someone could say the value of any person they're taking upon themselves. And the same thing with nodrim v'nidarim. They could take a vow to give the value of this person to the temple, and that would be the demei ploni alai, and someone could take a vow to put anyone else's value to the temple. Okay, it goes in both ways, right? You can be the one who's giving it, promising it, and you can be the one who is valued, right? Who your value is going to the temple. So, hachanami to lechatchila. You want to say that's lechatchila? Of course, that's not lechatchila. You shouldn't make these vows in an ideal world. Why not? Because the Torah says haktiv in the pasuk in Dvarim. It says in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 23, "V'chi takdal lindor lo yeh b'chachet." When you stop taking vows, you won't have a sin. What does that mean? It's a double negative, meaning you shouldn't take vows. Because vows just lead people to sin, because you promise things and then you can't keep your promise. How many times people, right, they promise, but they can't always live up to their promises. Better not to promise. And not enough that the Torah says it, but in Kohelet, it says, Uchtiv, Tov asher lo tidor mishetidor v'lo teshalem. Better not to vow at all than to take a vow and not to pay up your vow. Not to do it, not to fulfill it. So better not vow at all. Vitanya, now we're going to see, and not only do the psukim show this, but even in a Braita, there's a machloket about this, but even in the machloket, we're going to see that both sides really don't think ideally you should give vows. So let's see. At first glance, it sounds like someone does, but we're going to see that he in the end really doesn't. Tov mizeh mizeh, better than that and that, is she'eno noder kolikar. Really, ideally, better not to take a vow at all. Divrei Rabbi Meir, that's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Tov mizeh mizeh noder mishalem. The highest actually, right? Maybe there's, the middle is don't take a vow at all. But if you take a vow and you keep your vow, that's really the best. Now, Rabbi Yehuda sounds like he is saying it's a good thing. And then it would be lechatchila. But comes the Gemara and says, Afilu Rabbi Yehuda lo ka'amar. Rabbi Yehuda, even him, he was limiting it. Ela b'omer harei zo. If someone said, this animal will be, I'll bring this as a vow. I'm vowing to bring this animal. Now, we learned many times the difference between harei alai and harei zo, but I'll repeat it, especially if you're new. Harei, and even if you're not, you might forget. Harei zo means this is sanctified. That means if something goes wrong, something happens to that animal, or whatever it is, whatever object it is, I don't take responsibility because I said, this is sanctified. I didn't say, I promised to bring something. So if something were to happen to it, fine. I tried to sanctify, it didn't work. Okay, I'm off the hook. Turning now to Amud Bet, to the second side of the page. Aval amar harei alai lo. But even Rabbi Yehuda, who says better to take a vow and pay up, that's only if you say harei zo. But if you say I take upon myself to bring something to the temple, and then if I separate, or I designate something, and I don't bring it because it gets lost, I have to bring another one instead. Well, that's already, right, what are the chances are I'm really going to bring something else? Like I already lost it, I already designated that, but so if I say harei alai, I assume responsibility, and then if I don't pay up, right, there's more of a chance that I won't actually end up paying up my vow. So even Rabbi Yehuda doesn't think, even though he says good to take a vow and actually fulfill it, he doesn't think in a harei alai case you should do it. So what do you see here? It's definitely not lechatchila. And that's a good proof. So Rav Acha basically has succeeded in showing Rav Ashi that why are you even asking this question? Hakol is lechatchila. Hakol is not lechatchila because look, hakol marichim and nodrim is not actually ideal. People shouldn't do that in an ideal world. Okay, so now comes Rav Ashi and he says, okay, you tried to prove that hakol is not lechatchila, but I'm going to try to prove to you that hakol is lechatchila. And here he starts with his proofs, and I'll go back to the study guide so you can see it charted out. So he's going to have two proofs that get rejected, okay, but then he's going to come with his main point, which doesn't get rejected. V'kol hakol lav lechatchila hu. Wait, every hakol isn't lechatchila? Look, it is. Ela hakol chayavim b'sukkah, hakol chayavim b'tzitzit. Everyone has to sit in the sukkah. Everyone has to put on tzitzit. Hachanami de lav lechatchila. You're going to say that's not ideal? Of course. Everyone is obligated to do something. Obviously means it's ideal. It's from the start. So they said, okay, so comes Rav Acha and he says, no, chiyavim lo kamin. I wasn't talking about when it says akol chiyavim. I'm talking about when it says akol shochatim. Everyone slaughters. It doesn't say everyone is obligated to slaughter. If it says everyone is obligated, obviously that's ideal. Obviously you're obligated to do this, okay? But akol shochatim could still be not an ideal. Akol shochatim could be, well, if they did it, it works, okay? Your proof doesn't prove anything. Well, everyone does smicha on the korban. Now here notice the word chayavim is not there. Everyone does smicha. That's when you take your hands and you put your weight down on the animal. Men and women. Now, this is a bit of a problem. Okay, and the Masorah Shas points this out. And if you learned Menachot, you also know this, which is, if you remember, we learned that women actually don't do smicha, okay? There's actually a different sugya that talks about women can opt into it, but this source, hakol sumchim, echad anashim, doesn't exist, okay? And the Masorah Shas, which is like these notes put on the side of the Gemara, says, chipasnu b'chol hamakamot v'lo matzinu kem b'shum makom b'shas. Okay, we looked all over Shas, we couldn't find these words anywhere. This was before they had AI and search engines and all that. The adraba, if chamatzinu, we actually found the opposite. And then they point out, even the people who say it's women can, they only say it's optional. They don't say they all do it. So anyway, the point is, it doesn't even say in the Mishnah where we saw, it doesn't even say echad anashim, it just says hakol sumchim, but it doesn't include women. Anyway, point being that it doesn't really, okay, these words are problematic. That's why they're in parentheses here, because they really should be taken out as women, because women aren't obligated. But anyway, the point is, hakol sumchim, even if it doesn't include women, it means other men, and right, other categories it includes. The point being here, hachinami de lav lechatchila. What you're going to say? It's not lechatchila. Of course, this is lechatchila, and it doesn't use the word chayavim. V'haktiv v'samach yado v'nirtza. Put his hands, and it's accepted. Right. So you have to put your hands. You have to do smicha. So obviously, akol means lechatchila. To which Rav Acha responds and says, you're right. There are some hakols that are lechatchila, and there are some that are diavad, which we just proved. Because Rav Acha had hakol marichim v'nerachim nodrim v'nidarim isn't lechatchila, isn't ideal, and hakol sumchim is. So he says, you're right. Some are ideal, some are not ideal. Ela hakol dehacha, but since some are like this and some are like that, why'd you start with your question? Why'd you say that mimayz lechatchila u'detikshilach? Why'd you assume that a kol here is lechatchila, which didn't make sense in the context? Dilma diavadu v'lo tikshilach. Why don't you just say hakol here is b'diavad, is not a right? If it's already done, then we'll accept it, and then you won't even have the question. To which Rav Ashi responds and says, no, I'll explain to you why I have a question. And this we talked about before. Ana shchitatan kshera kasheli. What bothered me with the word shchitatan kshera in the Mishnah. Midekatane shchitatan kshera diavad. Now, the second part of that phrase, right, it started with hakol shochatim. Everyone can slaughter. And then it said shchitatan kshera. Now, because it says shchitatan kshera, which clearly means b'diavad, okay, it will be kosher if they did it anyway. Michlal da'akol lechatchilahu. From there you can infer that the first hakol must have been lechatchila because di'i diavad, tarte diavad lamali. If it's also b'diavad, post facto, then you're going to have hakol shochatin. Everyone can do it. Well, if they did it, it works, but that's what it means. And then shchitatan kshera, well, if they did it, it works. So you're saying the same thing twice, which means it must be saying two different things now. Okay, this was all to establish the question. Now we're going to say, so Rav Ashi is saying, that's why I think that since you have a choice, and sometimes it calls lechatchila, sometimes it's not, here it clearly must be lechatchila, which begs the question. What's it talking about in the first phrase, and what's it talking about in the second case? Why is the first phrase saying everyone can slaughter on an ideal world? And then it says, well, but if they did it anyway, it's still kosher, which is post facto. Okay, now we're going to get to the first answer to this question. It's Rabba Bar Ula, and he's going to answer. Rabba Bar Ula, right? Second, going back to my place inside because I've been following in the chart. Amar Rabba Bar Ula. Rabba Bar Ula says, Hachi Katani. This is the way it reads. Hakol shochatin va'afilu tameh bechulin. When it says hakol shochatin, what they're really trying to point out is even someone who's impure can slaughter non-sacred items. Okay? Now, Gemara says, what are you talking about? Okay, first question. Tameh bechulin ma'ila memra. What's this tameh bechulin? Okay, what are you trying to say by saying tameh bechulin? Because what does tumah have to do with chulin? Chullin is non-sacred items. The only problem of tumah, impurity, is by sacred items. We don't care if a non-sacred item becomes tameh. So, what do they say? Bechulin shenasu al ta'arat kodesh. What we're talking about here is chulin. Now, of course, by the way, it says hakol shochatin, even a tameh, but why do you even need to mention a tameh and chulin? So this is the way they answer it. It's talking about chulin shenasu al ta'arat kodesh. What is that? Some people, okay, mainly it was people we call the prushim, like to treat their non-sacred items as if they were sacred. And they treated them with sanctity as if they were sacrificial items. And what they're telling you is, kasaval, and obviously, okay, now, the question is, what's the status of, if you treat your chulin like tarat kodesh, there's a machloket about are they really kodesh or not. So kasavar, the person in the wrote this Mishnah, held the chulin shenasu al tarat kodesh ke kodesh damu. If you treat your chulin like tarat, like kodesh, then they're like kodesh. Okay, so now, and yet anyone can slaughter them, even a tamei person. Now we're going to explain this. Ketzad, we'll say. So how would he do it then, and why is it okay? If we treat it like kodshim, you shouldn't have a tamei person do it at all. So now, if you see the chart on the page, we're going to go through all the sections of the Mishnah and explain now the sections according to Rabba Bar Ula. Mevi sakina ruka, you bring a long knife, v'shochetba, kidei shelo yiga b'basal. Okay, you basically bring a very long knife, use it for slaughtering, so that you don't touch the meat. As long as you have this long knife and you're far away from the animal, we're not worried you're going to touch the meat. However, now we have to get to a b'diavad. So how do we get to a b'diavad? Well, b'mukdashim lo yishchot shem yiga b'basal. But if it's sanctified, don't slaughter it ideally, because you might touch the meat. So even though we treat chulin like kodesh, the people who do, so it's similar to kodesh, but it's not really kodesh. So we're going to be strict when it comes to actual kodshim and say, don't use the long knife, because you might accidentally touch the meat. When it's chulin that you're treating like kodesh, we'll be more lenient and say, oh, ideally you can. And that explains the ideal and the not ideal. Now, you shouldn't, now we're going to get to the not ideal, the shchitatan kshera. About mukdashim, if it's sanctified, you shouldn't slaughter, but im shachat, but if you did anyway, v'omer, bari li shelo nagati, I know I didn't touch it, shchitato kshera. That's the one that we could say your shchita works in a post facto. Okay? So the first two phrases, the first one's talking about chulin that were treated like kodesh, and the second is talking about kodshim. Now we get to chutz mecheresh shoteh katan, right? Now, what's this line about? Why can't they do it? Tafilu b'chulin grudei. Now, we're back to chulin. Di'avadamilo, they can't even do it post facto. Shema yeshu, shema yidrasu, shema yachlidu, because there's three possible things that could go wrong. Okay, there's more, but we're worried. Maybe they'll take a break in between. Maybe they'll do that's shihiyah, it's called. Shema yidrasu, maybe they'll stick the knife straight down, like cut the simanim, rather than using this back and forth motion, which is the way you're supposed to do it. And shema yachlidu. Shema yachlidu is maybe you'll put, okay, this is a way, yachlidu comes from a chulda, which is a mold that like goes into holes and hides. Maybe you'll put the knife in instead of putting the knife like on the neck and going back and forth to slaughter the animal. You'll put the knife inside under the skin and in between the two simanim, or maybe behind both, either in between or behind both of them, and then go in this outward motion out of the body. So like forward instead of from front to back, you're going to go from back to front, and that's disqualified. So they might not know how to do it properly, and they'll do the wrong thing. Now we're going to say v'kulan sheshachatu ahaya. Now what about this last line? And now they're going to raise a bunch of difficulties about this last line. What is it referring to? Ele acheresh shoteh katan alakai. If it's saying, if we just said the cheresh shoteh katan can't do it, but if they did and other people were watching them, it will be good. Well then, since it was talking about the previous sentence, it should have said v'im shachatu mebayale. It should have said, and if they slaughter it, this is what I said before when we read the Mishnah, then it's okay. Okay, so it can't be that. Ela atame b'chulin. If it's talking about someone tamei and chulin, well, it can't be that because ha'amar l'chatchila nami shachit. We said they can do it anyway, ideally. So you don't have to say, well, as long as someone's watching them. And ela atame b'mukdashim, if it's someone who's impure and they did it on sacrificial items, we already said b'bari lisage. It's fine as long as they say, I saw and it was good. So they say, delete command initially. It must be that the person's not there. Sorry, what did I do here by accident? I did something. I don't know how to get rid of it. Okay. Delete command initially. The person, we can say it's tamei b'mukdashim, who isn't there to tell us that I saw and I know I didn't touch it. So if we have someone else who saw and saw he didn't touch it and he used that long knife, then it will be fine. And that's what you could say that's referring to. You could also, by the way, say it's referring to the cheresh shoteh katan, and you could also say it's referring to the tamei b'mukdashim, and that's why it says v'kulan instead of saying, and if they did it, meaning the previous people, like we asked. Okay, but now we're going to have a second problem with this response, which is, if you're basically saying that the phrase shchitatan kshera is coming to say, if you slaughtered it and said, bari li shalom negati shchitato kshera, meaning it's talking about someone who's tamei, right, who's trying to slaughter mukdashim, and they can't do it, but if they did, and they said, it'll work. Well, hai tamei b'mukdashim mehacha nafka, is that really learned out of here? Mehatam nafka, it's actually learned from somewhere else, which is a Mishnah in Zvachim. It says there, kol hapsulim sheshachatu shchitatan kshera. Shashchita kshera bezarim, benashim, ba'avadim, ubitmeim. Notice it says, right, anyone who's disqualified, who slaughters, this means disqualified from being a kohen, okay, who can't be a kohen in the temple, but they can do slaughtering because slaughtering is not considered a major ritual act. That has to be done by a kohen. So their shchita is fine. How do we know this? Because shchita is good with a zar, non-kohen, a woman, slaves, Canaanite slaves, or impure people. Even high-level sanctity items, they can slaughter it. As long as the impure people don't touch the meat. Okay, so now basically what's the problem with the Gemara? The Gemara's problem is, why would our Mishnah be telling us about mukdashim, sanctified items, can be done by impure people, when it already says in the Mishnah, it's somewhere else in Zvachim, which is the main part where it talks about mukdashim, that a tamei person can do it. So, and if they did it, it's kosher. So it doesn't make any sense that it would be there and also here. Okay? So, Gemara answers, okay, they're going to answer two different answers with like just flipping the same kind of answer. One's going to say the Chullin is the central place, and it just happens to be mentioned Zvachim because of other things. And the other one says the reverse. Zvachim is the main place, and here it's just mentioned because of other things. So, Hacha Ikar, there it's the main place. Here it's the main place. Hatam Aidi Ditana Sharp Sulim Tanenani Tamei B'Mukdashim. Since they were talking about women and slaves and that, since it's talking about all others, so it also mentioned Mukdashim. Tanana, okay, Ibait Emo, or you could say Hatam Ikar de B'Kodshim Kai. That's the main place because it was all about Kodshim there. In our case, Hacha, I did Tane Tame B'Chulin, Tane Nami Tame B'Mukdashim. Here it just got to us because we were talking about Tame and Chullin, so they also mentioned Tame B'Mukdashim. So now we're going to ask another question. Okay? Hi Tame D'Itame B'Mai. Okay, this Tame, and we're just going to get to the question now. We'll deal with the answer later. Okay, next class. A Tame who became impure, with what did they become impure? Well, what kind of impurity? If it was Tame made, we're going to have a problem. Because the Torah talks about a halal cherev. Okay, when it's talking about impurity, it talks about a halal cherev, which means a dead body that was killed by the sword. But there's a special, kind of unique, weird halacha. Cherev hareu kechalal. The sword becomes like the dead body. Usually when impurity passes, it drops a level. Every time it touches something, it's one level below. Like the dead body is what we call a v'avota tumah. It touches a person becomes an avatuma, okay, or a vessel. The avatuma can touch, if that passes on impurity to the next level, it can be matame a person or vessels or food or drink, and they become a rishon. And the rishon can only be passed on impurity to drinks, and they become a sheni. So it always drops a level. But this halal cherev takes on the status of what it touches. So if it touches the dead body, it becomes a v'avoda tumah. If it touches a person who is a tamei meit, who became impure to a dead body, it becomes an avatuma. So if you say it was mitame b'meit, meaning the person who we're talking about, who's the slaughterer, was tamei meit, he's an avatuma. When he touches the knife, litame l'sakim, the sakim becomes what? An avatuma just like it. Now an avatuma can be mitame, a person and vessels and food and drink. So when that knife, which is now an avatuma, azal sakim v'timite lebasal, it basically turns the meat into impure. So how could you possibly say that as long as the person didn't touch the meat, it's okay? Because as soon as the person touched the knife, which obviously they touched, the knife passes on impurity then to the meat. So it can't be that it's tamei meit, because that doesn't make any sense. So we're going to have two answers. We'll get to those answers tomorrow. Okay, so that's our daf for today. So just to review, I like to review the daf. We started with we had to figure out, first of all, does it include women or not? We saw the machloket in Tosfot between the two opinions. But assuming it includes women, it includes all sorts of other people, they can do it. But it sounds like they could do it in an ideal sense, and then it sounds like we'll only be di'evet. So we then went into, right, and also we got rid of the cheresh, shoteh, they can't do it. But if someone's watching, then somehow other people that couldn't do it now can do it. And then we said, well, that sentence doesn't make sense. The first sentence, the next is di'avad. We then went to this back and forth with Rav Acha and Rav Ashi. Is really every time it says a kol, is it lechatchila or is it not lechatchila? Rav Acha tried to prove it's not lechatchila. Rav Ashi tried to prove it is lechatchila. In the end, Rav Ashi said, you're right, it can go both ways. But this context really seems to say it's lechatchila. So then we had to say that the first phrase is talking about tameh, who touches meat that we're treating like kodesh, but it's really chullin, and is slaughtering it, and that they could do it in an ideal, even if they're impure. And the second line is saying a tamei b'mukdashim shouldn't do it ideally, but if they did, as long as the knife was long and they didn't touch it, they know they didn't touch it, it's fine. And then the kulan was even the tamei b'mukdashim, if the person isn't there to answer us, did he touch it, did he not, or did she touch it, did she not, but someone saw, then it could work. Okay, then we could say it's kosher. Then we had a few questions on this whole thing, which was, right, there were some questions. Didn't we learn the tamei b'mukdashim from somewhere else? And then what kind of tamei are we talking about? Because it doesn't sound like it's tamei meit. Okay, and we're going to get back to that in the next class, with that, wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom and Shabbat Tov, and we'll meet up together for Chullin Daf Gimel.